Hello and welcome to the Alpha Anywhere demo and Q&A webcast. I'm Dave McCormick, VP of Product Management here at Alpha Software. And I'm pleased to be joined by Sarah Mitchell, our Director of Customer Success. Today, Sarah has got a presentation on using Alpha Anywhere with Ionic Appflow to create mobile applications. And I think you're going to find it quite interesting. If you have questions on this topic or on any other Alpha Anywhere topic, go ahead and type them into the questions box of the GoToWebinar control panel. All right, so let's get started. Hello, Sarah, are you there?
I am. Can you hear me?
I can.
And you can see my screen, I presume?
I can already see your screen as well. Yep,
All right,
we're
fantastic.
ready to
Yeah,
go.
yeah, we are ready to go. Thank everybody for joining us today on Groundhog Day of all things, obscure February holiday. Let's see if I can figure out how to make the presentation go. There we go. We're going to talk about publishing mobile apps today with Ionic Appflow. And if you may notice, I've got a new PowerPoint. Finally have updated from Office 2010 to the modern age. So we should have some more exciting presentations. And that error that I always saw when I started it about my drivers not being right is gone. So that's fantastic. So today's agenda, we're going to do an overview and talk about the required resources for doing an Ionic Appflow build from Alpha Anywhere. We're going to talk a bit about the Cordova builder, which you have to use in order to generate the files so that you can publish to Ionic Appflow. We're going to talk about building and testing on Ionic Appflow, and we're going to review some common mistakes. And in all of this, we're primarily going to focus on iOS and building for that platform because building for iOS is the more complicated piece. Android is a lot easier. There's less pitfalls there, and it's much easier to build, test, and deploy to Android and the Google Play Store than it is for iOS. And that's largely based on how Apple has structured requirements around certificates and provisioning profiles. So to start, I just want to talk about just what is Ionic Appflow. And Ionic Appflow is a cloud-based service that allows you as an Alpha Anywhere developer to build a mobile app for iOS or Android using Ionic Appflow's continuous integration, continuous deployment platform. We integrated Ionic Appflow into the app once we learned that PhoneGap build was going away and was no longer going to be around. And in that transition period between PhoneGap build to whatever anybody was going to be using, Ionic did step up and take that on to try to make their platform as compatible as possible with Cordova apps. Cordova is the framework we use on the back end for generating the application files so that they can run on iOS and Android. So that's why we went with Ionic Appflow. There are some more requirements with Ionic Appflow than we had with PhoneGap, but by and large, using Ionic Appflow to build an app has proven to be very easy for iOS, and we've tried to eliminate every possible point in the process that might require that you own a Mac. So if you're using Ionic Appflow, you don't need a Mac. But you do need these things. You need a paid Ionic Appflow account. You can't build a mobile app with Ionic Appflow using their free plan. You can generate a web app, but if you're going to be building a web app, why would you do that when you're also going to need the application server? So you're better off just sticking with the application server in that case. But for iOS and Android, you do need a paid account. You're also going to need a GitHub account. You're going to need the GitHub desktop application, which we open as part of the process for publishing to Ionic. If you're going to build for iOS, you're going to need an Apple developer account. I believe it's something like $100 a year. And then for Android, you may need a Google Play developer account. You certainly need one if you get to the point where you're ready to deploy on Google Play. You may need the application server if your app requires anything that has to run on the server. And then in the case of Alpha Cloud, if you have a database, if you need to store files, you also need to bring a database storage hosting solution with you. And for those of you running Community Edition, this is important because you can only publish to Alpha Cloud from Community Edition. So having a third-party hosting service for your database, such as Amazon's web services or Amazon S3 for storing files, that's going to be something you need to consider. So when building for Ionic Appflow, it all starts in Alpha Anywhere with the Cordova builder. And the Cordova builder can be found on the Web Projects Control panel. We'll go take a look at that here now, but before we get there, I just wanted to say that the builder generates the assets that you need to build your app on Ionic Appflow. So if we take a look, I think I have Alpha Anywhere open. I do. All right. So if you're in Alpha Anywhere, and this is the Web Project Control Panel, and this one's got a bunch of stuff on it because it's just my default testing space. Up here, there's a Cordova button. You click here. This opens up the Cordova project settings, which is the Cordova builder for building applications Ionic Appflow. This is also where you could use CLI, command line interface, if you'd prefer to do it that way. But the app build target is the setting you need to set. This is already an existing project, but when you come in here to set up your project, you need to make sure to specify the platforms you're going to build for. So if you're building your app for Android, you'll check Android. If you're building for iOS, you check iOS. If you're building for both, you check both. And this just exposes the settings in here for the various platforms for configuring your build. If you prefer to keep your builds separate, like if having your iOS stuff in one bucket and Android in another bucket makes it easier for you to kind of keep track of what you're building in Ionic, which we'll look at that interface later. It's perfectly reasonable to come up here and create two projects, one for your iOS, one for your Android, to keep them separate. It'll still all come from the same code base, but I just wanted to throw that out there for folks who might get a bit overwhelmed by this builder when you've turned on all the things. It might be easier for you to process it if you've only picked one. When you're setting up your build for the first time, it's there are a few things, and we'll talk about iOS here. A few things that are really important to know when you're setting this up so that you don't fall into our common mistakes, which we'll talk about later. You do need to specify which UX component is your app. Generally, you probably want to make sure your app is contained within one UX for simplicity. You're also going to need to specify your URL for AJAX callbacks. So if your application needs to do things on the server, such as run an XBasic script, or you're using any of the action JavaScripts to make a callback to the server to handle something, such as upload a file to S3, you're going to need to specify this URL for AJAX callbacks. And that URL is the URL on the application server where you've published your app. So in addition to setting up the Cordova projects and generating your files, you also need to publish your application to the server if it has any server-side code in it that needs to be run. And one of the easiest ways to figure out this URL is to first publish your app, maybe with a test page in it that you know, and then go open that page up on the server, wherever you've put it, cloud, IIS, classic server, and then just copy that URL down and take all the stuff off of the end, like the A5W page piece. There's a bunch of links in here to try to help you figure that out. By all means, if you're building an app and you're getting stuck on this, please email guides@alphasoftware.com. We are more than happy to help you figure that out. But that's important for having callbacks. The first time you go through this, you do want to generate your project asset files, because if you don't have them, then you can't build. Any additional files that you need, images, external JavaScript files, other components, those get specified in additional files required. And then also, if your app uses on-device SQLite databases, you need to specify that here as to include them. With iOS, you're going to need to, not just need, you have to generate your image resource files to build an iOS app. If you don't have them, you're going to run into problems because it expects them to exist. But making sure that this option is checked so you can come down here and specify both your master icon and your storyboard launch images, which are shown when the app launches. Those are two things you need to specify. Now, in the current release that's out there, 8,000, I believe is the build number, we do not generate images for you by default. So if you don't specify images here, none will be generated. In the next release, we came back through in here and said, hey, let's just put some default images in there for you so you don't run into this issue. Now, those defaults will be our logo and our splash screen with our logo on it. But if you have your own, great, add them here. If you don't have your own, you can use ours. You can find them in the installation directory, which is going to be in C program files x86, the location where it's installed. Yours is probably going to say Alpha Anywhere. I'm running the nightly build of Community Edition that I've installed separately, so I'm going to come in here, but this structure is going to be the same for everyone. And what you're going to want to do is scroll down, and there's a PhoneGap folder. And in here, there's some default images. And so this one is your iOS launch image, which is the size required for storyboard images, the recommended size. And this other one here, app icon, is the recommended app icon. So you are certainly welcome to use those just so you have a resource so you don't run into errors later. Because if you don't have those specified, your build's going to fail. The next section that you need to know about is app options. This is where you specify your app ID, which is they recommend a reverse, or it must be a reverse domain name style. So if your website is www.myapp.com, the reverse of that would be com.myapp.www. That goes here. Version number, recommend you increment this every single time you do a new build, and that's for you, but it's also for your users when they install it. And your application name, description, who you are. These defaults are going to say things like Alpha Anywhere. So you definitely want to update that. You're going to want to include your app email and info link. Supported orientations. Does your app only work in landscape? Does it only work in portrait, or does it work in both? Default means both. Option to enable full screen, which would hide the status bar at the top of the screen in the application. And then something called allow access origin, which just specifies any external resources you're allowed to access. This says all of them, but if you wanted to block access to things, you could specify that here. And while we're on the topic of accessing things, something that you're not going to find in here, but I do want to call it out, is that in if you're building a mobile app, and this is specifically important, if you are also using the application server to host your server-side code, you need to come into the web project properties and make sure to set your cookie same site value to unset. So changes have happened over the years, and as browser developers try to like lock down their browsers to increase security and reduce vulnerabilities to folks. And one of those things as they've done is they've increased the restrictions around cookies. Cookies are pieces of information sent from the server to the app, or from the app back to the server. If you pick anything in here besides unset for your mobile app, your app will not be able to connect or communicate with the application server. So if you have something like a login, that's not going to work, because it's going to get the access to that's going to be denied by the app out of hand. So make sure to set that on unset. This is settings for iOS and Alpha Cloud. I believe there's a separate section you need to go to set that up for the classic server, but it's something to keep in mind. This text down here in the corner that's in all caps but blue, it talks about that same site setting and why you need to do it. iOS privacy and resource usage strings. It is important you guys come in here if you're using any kind of on-device, what are they called? Hardware. So the GPS or the camera. Apple wants you to provide a short reason as to why you need that access if it's something that your app's going to request the customer for. And you do want to come here and update these to make sure they're as descriptive but concise as possible. Because that, if you don't have those usage strings in here, that is going to be a reason why you may get rejected from the App Store. But you can update those usage descriptions here. And then finally, Xcode build deployment target. I believe the current minimum is 13, but over time, Apple comes out with restrictions of what the operating systems you're allowed to build your apps for, and they do have a minimum. And so making sure that this is set to the correct minimum is important, especially if we end up in a situation where that has changed, but we haven't put out a new update yet where we've removed that minimum and bumped it up higher for you. Coming in here and making sure that that's set properly. And that's something that's documented up with Apple's iOS store, the App Store. It's just the App Store now. That's something that they do clearly document as a requirement when you're publishing to them. And then beyond that is all the plugins that your app uses. We enable some of them for you automatically based on what you're using in your app as you're building it. Excuse me. And so by and large, most of what you need should be in here, but you just want to come through and make sure that you've enabled the things that you're using. That's something you're going to have to keep track of as you're developing. What plugins am I using, and make sure you're adding them in here. Sometimes they may have additional. Some of these plugins might require other plugins. We try our best to make sure that we're including those for you, but every once in a while something changes. So if you run into a situation where you've included the plugin but it doesn't seem like it's not building right, and you're seeing some sort of plugin error in the builder in Ionic, contact us immediately so that we can help you sort that out. So that's the project settings builder. Once you have this all set up and you're ready to build, there's a button down here that says Save and Build for Ionic Appflow. You click that, it takes you to the next screen. That's okay. We will just ignore this. And I'll go find my other one. I don't have a next screen for you. Let's see if it'll open it for me. There we go. So the first time you go through this, it is going to ask you where do you want to save your files. And you do need to save, and these are the files that are generated for Ionic Appflow, and you're going to want to put them in a folder that's outside your application repository because those files have to go into GitHub. And the reason why you can't or shouldn't keep them in your web projects folder is that if your web project is a GitHub repository, which is something you can turn on and use, you can't nest another GitHub repository in it. It has to be outside the project folder. So I've got, where is it? Ionic. I'll put it in there. All right. So once you give it a place to save, the next thing that's going to happen is GitHub Windows is going to launch. If this isn't installed, you're going to run into problems. This is how we've chosen to try to keep it as simple as possible for creating the repository and providing an easy way for you to synchronize that back up to GitHub. If you don't have a repository already, you'll have to add it. I'm just going to call this one default. You'll have to click this link here. These will be grayed out down here, but though you can't tell, there's a link right here. It says create a repository. Give it a name. Default is being pulled from the Cordova builder itself. It's the name of the project, the default name. Let's see if I can zoom in here real quick. Right here, it's pulling that name out. You probably don't want to call it default unless you only have one app that you're ever going to build. So you probably want to give that a meaningful name, possibly a description. You may or may not want to initialize it with a README file. It's not required, but then you click Create Repository. And then the final step after this, once you've created the repository, which is going to be made locally, is to then push it up to your GitHub account. So we'll wait for this to run here. Actually, we can let that run for a bit. We'll go back and talk briefly about GitHub. Oh, never mind, it finished. So when that's finished, it's made a local repository, everything gets committed. You're going to see this button here. It's called Publish Repository. You click that, it's going to ask you on github.com, what is the name of the repository you're going to create? Now, this has to be unique in your account. Description is optional. And then there's a checkbox down here that says keep this code private, and I highly recommend that you keep that checked, because you can always take a private repository on GitHub and make it public, but it's basically impossible to go the other direction, because once it's public, it's public. Everyone has access to it forever because we archive the whole internet all the time. So keeping it private gives you the most flexibility in the long term if that's something that you want to keep within your company, within your team. At some point, if you want to decide like, hey, yeah, I don't want to share this with the world, you can always turn that off. But keep that, keep it private. You give it a name. It's called QA. I'm going to publish it. I'm not going to build an Ionic Appflow using this repository today, because there's a few other pieces that have to happen, such as publishing that component up onto Alpha Cloud. And because I have been bitten by the statement, it says in there it could take up to 15 minutes or more for it to get spun up. I've been bitten by that in the past, so we're going to skip over that. But once that's up in GitHub, you're ready to go to move on to the next piece, which is building your app, Ionic Appflow. So let's see here, current slide. So we just talked about configuring this. In terms of publishing it, we just saw the piece where we generated the Ionic Appflow files. We talked about image assets that you need. The other piece that we didn't do, but is very, very important to do, is you need to publish that component, your app, to the application server, so that when your app is running and needs to make those callbacks to run the server-side code, it exists and it can run it. And then finally, committing those generated files to GitHub is the last piece you need before we can move on to building an Ionic Appflow project. And so talk about two things here. The first one is creating a new project. So let's go take a look at Ionic Appflow. And keep in mind that I have a few examples in here. When you get your Ionic Appflow account and the first time you come in this dashboard, there's not going to be anything here in apps. In fact, I could just delete the app real quick here, because these are all test apps that I create all the time to update doc or create new tutorials that I'm hoping to have out. I don't want to say this month, but probably this month. So you're going to probably see something like this. And so once you've got your app built and it's up in GitHub, you can then come over here to the new button and say import existing app. And what this will let you do is import an app that you've put up in GitHub into a new project. So webinar demo. Let's connect it here. All right, so the way I configured my Ionic Appflow login is I actually log in with my GitHub credentials. If you use something else, or just like a name and password, and you set that up, you may be prompted at this point to provide your GitHub credentials to approve access to GitHub so that it can access your project. So once it's connected, you can choose, let's call this one a webinar test. Looks like it cleared that out after I connected it. And it's going to list all your tests in here. Let's take that one. It's not the one we created, but it is one I've used a few times. So you connect it to your GitHub account. At that point, you have a commit and you're ready to start building. So let's go on to the next piece here. So create a new project from an existing project and then link it to GitHub. If you go through the other option that says new, Ionic will automatically generate some files for you, and pretty sure that's not what anybody wants. So make sure to import an existing project. So once that's set up, you're now ready to build, and we're going to talk about briefly what that workflow is. So when you build on Ionic Appflow, So it's a 3 to 4 step process, and I say that because the step 3 you only have to do it once. But you pick which commit you want to use. So in the example we just saw where I added one, there was only one commit. But if you've made changes and committed those changes over time, there's going to be a few to choose from, and you're likely going to want to pick the one that you did most recently. So that's the first step. You then need to choose the platform and the type. Are you building for iOS or Android? And then the type, is it a debug build? In the case of Android, is it a development build in iOS? Development means debug for iOS. Or are you trying to build for the App Store or production case? Those are going to have different requirements around the certificates that you need to use. Android doesn't require certificates if you're building a debug build, but once you're ready to start building a build for deployment, you have to go off and create those certificates. iOS always requires certificates, and we'll talk about that briefly. And in that case, you do have to set it up. You do have to have an Apple developer account. That is the paid version at that point to start building for testing. But once you have all that stuff in place, you click build, and Ionic takes care of the rest. They go off, they start the build. You can walk away. You can close the whole website down and come back later, and it'll be sitting there for you. But that's the process, and then once it's built, you can then go to the next phase. But like I said, certificates, do you need one? And if you're building for iOS, yes, 100% you absolutely do. And for the case of development, you're gonna need an Apple development certificate. You don't need a Mac to make these. So in the past, to get to this point, to get a certificate, you would have to go through Xcode to generate the files. But we have in Alpha Anywhere the Certificate Genie. And I wanted to show you guys what that looks like. So in the Cordova builder, when it's open, down here there's a link that says iOS Certificate Genie. You open that up, and it's going to walk you through the process of creating your certificate and your provisioning profiles and everything that you need. So at this point, or everything you need so that you can then build on Ionic. And within here, just read everything carefully. It's going to explain to you what you need. So like this first step is just asking you, where are you going to save this stuff? What's your login to your Apple developer account? That's just your user ID. And then a password for the P12 file that's going to be generated for you through this walkthrough. But once you have those things in place, you can then add your certificate to Ionic Appflow. And so if I go over here and click Start Build and say iOS and development, down here it says you need a signing certificate before you can build this. So once you have all those files, you just come in here, add your signing certificate, give it a name, iOS dev, enable iOS, and it's going to ask for those two files. So your storage certificate and your provisioning profile. Your storage certificate, you also need to provide your password for that file. But once those are in place, your certificate's been added. You never have to do that again. Back in the build process itself, when you build here, there will be a drop down that you can choose the certificate that you've added. So for development, you're going to need a development certificate. For App Store, you're going to need a deployment certificate. So those options you're going to see in the Apple developer interface when you're creating your certificates. It's going to prompt you for which type. And the two types, the two types in there that you care about most for building mobile apps with Alpha Anywhere are Apple development and Apple distribution. And then a real quick note on iOS provisioning profiles. This is important. The provisioning profile includes the devices that you might want to use for testing, whether it be through DIOE or Testflight. And specifically for the DIOE test case or use case, those UUIDs need to be in that provisioning profile. If you get all the way to the end of the build process and you're like, oh no, I forgot to add it, you have to you have to go back, add that UUID to your provisioning profile, and then rebuild your app with that new profile in order to then test it on your app using the DIOE product. So you've got Ionic Appflow set up, you published your app to the application server, you generated your files, you've got them all committed up into GitHub, you've run the build, it succeeded. So you're ready to test. And for iOS and Android, there are a few options. For iOS, you can use Testflight, which is through Apple. Ionic Appflow makes it easy to connect that together with your accounts through their interface. But the other option is DIOE, which is a website. Excuse me. Let me see if I can pull that up for you real quick. Let's Google it. And I may have spelled it wrong on the slides. There we go. So the DIOE is a website where you can upload your IPA file, which you can download from the Ionic Appflow. When the build completes, that's one of the files you can download. You put it in here, you can send it out to people whose UUID are in your provisioning profiles, and this is a very easy way to go from that build to test without having to negotiate with Apple about Testflight stuff, because there are some there's a process in there and it takes a little bit of time to get that set up and running. I believe Testflight does let you invite people who may not have been included in your provisioning profile. So that's an option if you can't get UUIDs from people. And it's certainly a recommendation if you've gotten to the point where you think you're ready to go to the App Store, go through the Testflight first, because they will let you know if there's something missing. But you can upload your app here, test it. And then Android has something called testing tracks, which you can find out more information about in their Google Play documentation. And I believe you can just install Android directly on your phone without having to go through anything. So that's a big overview. I did want to talk very briefly about some common mistakes I've seen people make. I myself have made some of these, and I've touched on them already. But when you build an Ionic Appflow, if your build fails, you're just going to see a lot of text, a lot of red text maybe, and these weird messages like source path does not exist. Resources screen iOS default at 2x universal any.png. That particular error means you didn't include your storyboard images. So you need to go back and make sure your image resources are included before you do the build. Another error you might see is set key chain item import MAC verification failed during PKCS12 import. Wrong password. Something's wrong with your iOS certificates, or the password, or you've uploaded the wrong certificate for your provisioning profile. So just go back through and verify you've got the right certificate, the right provisioning profile, and the correct password, and set up your certificate again for that build and then build again. If you're still running into problems, definitely contact us. And then this one is specific to DIOE. Unable to install, this app cannot be installed because its integrity could not be verified. Most of the cases I've seen where this has happened, the UUID was not in the provisioning profile. I did this myself. Once I got the UUID in there, it worked. So something to keep in mind, DIOE does have additional documentation on their site for possible causes for this error. You can find it by searching for this error, or you can email guides@alphasoftware.com and I can send you guys a link if that's something you've run into and you want help with. And then that's the end of my presentation.
Excellent.
So do we have questions?
Sarah? There are questions. So let's just start right here. Someone pointed out you don't necessarily need UUIDs if you're using Testflight.
No, you don't. Yeah, that is correct.
Awesome.
Yeah.
And is that for, do you need to have some special account with Testflight, or is that just
So with
something?
Testflight, that's run through Apple, and you have to go through.
The
You have
enterprise
to,
program, I believe, is the one
yeah,
that
you have to
made. So that's the $300 one as opposed to the $100 one.
probably, yeah.
Is what I
That's a good point.
quickly. I'm not sure you can do it with a cheaper Apple account or not. I guess you'd have to find
Right.
it out.
And then you do have to get, like, Apple does do like an approval process on that. So I suspect there are cases where they just won't let you do a test flight.
Interesting. Yeah.
I suspect. Of course, I don't have any data to back that up. So
Okay, so speaking of money, someone said, well, this sounds expensive. What does it cost for Ionic Appflow to use?
all right.
So
So
I've
the
seen
the
their prices
baseline.
all over the place. I see 25,000, I see 2,500 a month, and I also see 150 a month if you're doing it as a independent developer.
So their base plan is $49 as
Is
an
49.
individual. Yeah, it's the
Yep.
cheapest one they have. Now there's some stipulations around that you're not a multi-million-dollar company,
Hmm.
or even a $1 million company.
Right.
So it's a really low price. The next cheapest one that they offer up from that is like $3.99 a month, which is pricey, and I agree. If
And at that
costs,
point, though, I'm looking at it, you need to be making around $500,000 a year for that. So if you're an independent person not making that, you're probably still fine with the
yeah, if you're an
the
independent.
Indians.
For a
You're an
larger
independent
corporate
person, right?
company,
Yeah.
maybe that's, yeah, if
Mhm.
you're a larger company, that's way outside your budget.
Mhm.
If you do the math on what a monthly subscription to Ionic Appflow is, at the cheapest price versus buying a Mac to do your building,
Mhm.
I think after about a year or so, the Mac starts to become cheaper just in pure dollars. But you also
Yeah.
have to look at it from the perspective of, if you're building on the Mac, you are now using the command line interface to build. And while you will eventually get to the point where you're comfortable doing that, there is a learning curve,
Mhm.
and it can be quite daunting for folks. So keep in mind that Ionic Appflow is taking that away from you, and you don't have to worry about it.
Okay. So there are pluses and minuses. Gotcha. Um, Here's another one, not specifically about Ionic Appflow, but it has to do with the plugins. And the question is, how do you find out more detailed information about the plugins that Alpha Anywhere has included?
Right. So if you want to know information about a specific plugin, down here there's a little info section. It says plugin ID, Cordova, plugin, globalization, and the registry is NPM. So plugins come from a variety of sources.
Hmm.
This one for globalization is coming from NPM, Node Package Manager, I believe is what it's
So you
called.
could go to
So if you go up
NPM.
to Google, NPM, and you find npmjs.com, and then if we go back to Alpha Anywhere and we just take a look at that, it says Cordova, plugin globalization, Cordova, plugin globalization. You can search for it, and this first one is the
There it
exact
is.
match, so that's probably the one we're including. You can find information here about it. Also within here, with open document, I'm not sure if any of these actually will take you. So this takes you to Cordova plugins, just their website. It looks like it's loading a bunch of stuff. That link takes you there. This is Alpha Anywhere phone grab documentation plugin. Thought at one point we had a way to link these, but I don't think we have that anymore.
But if you know
But
the plugin ID and which
yeah,
registry it comes from,
yeah,
it's NPM most of the time, but sometimes it's a different one as well.
yeah. Sometimes it's GitHub.
Sometimes it's GitHub, right?
Sometimes it's GitHub. Yeah,
Yep. And then,
and I
then
think
you can go directly to the developer site and then they can show you what you want.
click more. Yeah, so this one, the Alpha Anywhere, the Alpha Web WK WebView engine, the registry is Git. That means it's on GitHub. But yeah, that's down here in the description. And then also you can include your own plugins. Actually don't know off the top of my head how you would do that. So I'll make it a point to investigate that so that I know it for next time.
Someone brings up an excellent point, and that is, why not just use Alpha Launch And the answer
That is a
is
good point. So if
absolutely just use Alpha Launch. I mean, if you really have to have it your own brand in the store, then that's why you have to do this. Or
yeah,
if you want to use plugins that we haven't included, that's the other reason to do it. Although
yeah.
if you ask and you say, hey, I have a legitimate reason why you might want to include this plugin for other people as well, we may add that plugin to launch. So we are always taking a look for the ones that we can add to launch. Someone else pointed out that you can actually get a Mac cloud subscription for $20 a month. So
You
that would
can.
be, yeah, so that would be cheaper and let you do this building stuff without Ionic Appflow. But again, you'd still have to use the command line interface, which has got a bit of a learning curve, as you pointed out.
It does. And the other thing to note is if you have a Mac like physically in the room with you that you're building on, you can connect it directly to your device to install
Yeah,
from Xcode. You can't do that with the Mac and Cloud. You can use DIOE though to do the same thing.
interesting. Okay.
Yeah, I think with the direct connection though with your device, I think there might be some debugging facilities available for that.
Yeah. So having used both, I found the Mac really fairly easy to get into. So if you're thinking about getting a Mac, even a used Mac Mini would do the job here. And you can always remote into that from your PC or the other way around if you prefer. All right. Well, it looks like we have oh, so we have one more question, and we do have some time, and that is, can you give sort of a high-level overview of Alpha Launch and kind of what it is? Maybe describe what it does, even if we don't have
Yeah, so
slides for it.
Alpha Launch is a mobile app available in the Google Play and the App Store,
Hmm.
um, run by Apple, that you can install on your device for free. It's free download. It includes a bunch of plugins. And what you can do with it is you can publish your application to your application server using close this, under more Alpha Launch. There's publish apps to Alpha Launch. So you can publish your apps to your server where they're hosted, or even host them up in S3, our S3 bucket or your S3 bucket, the dense installation files specifically. You still need to publish your app to the server if it does any kind of server-side code stuff. But that's the piece you have to do. You provide the location of where those files live, and then they get installed in Alpha Launch, and they operate like they were natively installed. They work offline. You can have security login and stuff like that. The gotcha, which Dave alluded to earlier, is that it's not going to have branding. You're going to have zero discoverability for your apps in the App Store. So that's important to you.
So
That's
you'd
the
have
reason
to
why you want
tell
to go
your
with Ionic.
users, like if you had corporate users or someone who
Yeah.
was using it privately within an organization, Alpha Launch is terrific. You would tell them,
Yep.
get the Alpha Launch app, open it up, and then when they open it up, do you hand them, what is it, a URL? Can you do a
So
QR code?
yeah, so you have to install the server, which is done through QR code scanning.
Hmm.
If you would like to know more in depth about how that works and how to set it up, we did do a webinar on this last year, quite
Hmm.
recently. And Dave can go dig up the YouTube link for you and put it
I'll
in the
send out
chat.
the link if I can find it here. Absolutely. But
Yeah.
yeah, as the high level overview was asked for, the high level one is it's a shell of an application you can kind of think of that we've already put in the stores for you, and you can run your own Alpha Anywhere applications inside that. Basically, you give it a UX component that you're going to run.
Yeah,
Someone
that's a
said,
better
can you
high
have
level
multiple
overview.
versions of Alpha Launch for different clients? Well, yeah, you could absolutely set up your servers in such a way that one set of clients gets this collection of apps and another set of clients gets a different collection of apps altogether. So yep, you can totally do that.
I guess along the lines of Alpha Launch, we also have another app that you might find in the App Store if you look for it, called Alpha Shell, for strictly testing UX components on a mobile device, not a deployment platform, just a testing platform. And that's accessed from in here in the menu. There's this Alpha Shell QR code. Your app does need to be published to a server for that as well.
Fantastic.
That's again a testing tool for you to test out your components, see if it's going to work.
Fantastic.
on
Well,
mobile.
I just posted that video to chat, so go ahead and grab that link for anyone who wants to know how to publish mobile apps with Alpha Launch. You're right, this was done last year. It was done in May
It
of
was, yeah,
last year.
right after we did a new update
And
to
it was
Alpha
done by
Launch.
you, Sarah, so it's probably accurate, I'm going to say.
As accurate as it's going to be.
Wonderful. Well,
Yeah.
it looks like we are out of questions. If you do have further questions, of course, you can send them to guides, GUIDES, at alphasoftware.com. Sarah, thanks very much for presenting today. Thanks, everyone, for showing up and asking questions. Hope to see you at our next Wednesday webinar. Until then, take care and stay well. Bye-bye.